it stands out if it's very easy to do for that planning officer. That's what you've got to understand. The adversarial relationship between an applicant and a planning officer has never worked. It's the best way, in my mind, to getting planning permission is to make it as seamless as it possibly can be for you and the planning officer to make a decision. The first critical thing you need to know about getting planning permission is to get into the mind of the planning officer. I don't mean doing like a psycho evaluation when you see their name come up. What I mean is understanding how planning officers work and the environment that they work in. Every time that you contact a planning office to find out how your application is doing, they'll tell you, oh, we're really busy at the moment, so it's taking a little bit longer than usual to get your decision done. I mean, that's not news. That's just how planning officers have always worked. So in the 10 plus years I've been in planning, every council has always been busy for that whole decade. So don't necessarily believe that that's like that's a kind of an anomaly. Planning offices are incredibly busy all the time. Budgets have only been cut, so that gives a kind of insight into how planning officers work. So basically what that comes down to, so when a planning officer gets your application, you are one of 100 plus at the moment. I mean, I remember when I was at my busiest, I was looking at 90 plus applications and I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. And now it's quite common for planning officers to be working on 100 plus. I mean, that is an insane amount of work to be doing. So understanding that context really helps you frame how you should submit your application, because if your application is one of 100, it stands out if it's very easy to do for that planning officer. That's what you've got to understand. The adversarial relationship between an applicant and a planning officer has never worked. It's the best way, in my mind, to getting planning permission is to make it as seamless as it possibly can be for you and the planning officer to make a decision. So if a planning officer gets an application that's simple, it's clear, the applications are there, the drawings are clear, they will prioritize that because it's so easy. They'll, oh, this is really good for my stats. Because don't forget, planning officers are constantly being looked at by their managers, the government, residents, and you, applicants, who want to get their permission done on time. So making it as easy as possible works for everyone. It works for you and it works for the planning officer to get your decision done on time. And if you want to go further on getting the inside track on how to get planning permission for anything that you want to do, click the link below to get the 6-step hack to unlock huge amounts of value with your next property. The other key thing that you need to know is when you get to meetings with planning officers, this is kind of seen as like a humongous opportunity for applicants to get the inside track on officers. I've got a meeting, this is so exciting. So they put loads and loads of effort into it. And what often ends up happening between an officer and an applicant, or even their agent, is that it becomes a kind of an opportunity for the applicant to moan about why decisions aren't being made on time, why we haven't heard from them, that kind of thing, or why maybe their stance on an application has changed. So again, going back to what I said before is about how busy they are, the easier the better. Now, I'm not saying that you should just sit back and just take the decision as is, but one key thing you need to know about planning officers and the departments they work in is that quite often planning officers are just a front sometimes for what a decision that is being made behind them, sometimes by their managers or sometimes by the councillors even. And that's quite important to know, because quite often an officer, I've done it many a time, where I would recommended it one way, say a refusal or an approval, but then it gets overturned by sometimes management. But the key thing that you should maybe do some research on is if they're turned over by councillors. So a good bit of research that you can do is that when you go to council's website, look for their planning committees and have a look at their decisions that have been made. So on every committee, normally 3 or 4 weeks after the committee, the minutes come out, and that tells you what the decision was. But if you link that, so if you find any refusal and you link that to the officer's report, which will be in the committee pack as well, if you find that a lot of decisions are being overturned by the committee, then you can kind of get an understanding that decisions are being made on behalf of the officers, and sometimes It means that the development management team, the planning officer and their team and the managers are getting undermined by the committee, either being undermined or sometimes they just make bad recommendations, so the committee are trying to fix that. If you want to go really deep on that, you can then look at do an appeal search. And in an appeal search, if you follow that same application that you've noticed has been overturned, if that appeal has then been overturned the other way by the inspectorate, that's a sign that the committee are undermining the development management team and the planning officer, but are actually making the wrong decision. So in actual fact, the planning officer is making the right decision in the first instance, but it's getting all the way to appeal for them to get that decision back, because in the middle, the committee has made the wrong decision. So that bit of research, I think, is quite advanced, I guess, but it's public information. You can find it anywhere. It just takes a bit of time to do because you've got to follow each application. But that's what I mean. So when you get into meetings and you get contact with the officer, sometimes you're right. Sometimes they're not doing the right thing, and that's fine. I understand that. I was making those things. I was making wrong decisions sometimes as an officer myself, but also understand that if they're working in an authority where their decisions are constantly being undermined by the committee, just understand that position. So it's not really a case of just having a go at the officer for doing the wrong thing or not doing what you wanted. They might just be following a decision that's been kind of imposed on them by councillors and or managers. So just understanding that dynamic. Planning officer is quite often a front for everything that's going on behind them. And that's true if you're an applicant, an agent, a resident that wants to moan. Quite often residents moan at planning officers. Again, it's not always their fault. They're just going through the application as they see it, and they can't do anything about that. So understanding that dynamic is quite key and will really help you in your negotiations with the officer and the authority in general, so giving you the best chance of getting planning permission. So the third key thing I think you should know about getting planning permission and getting the inside track on what goes on inside a planning office is, it sounds obvious, but so often it's not done, is making your planning application as clear as possible. So, and not hiding any information. That's an age-old tactic used by some applicants to kind of hide where a window might overlook somewhere, or where the daylight might not be acceptable, so they kind of bury it in reports, that kind of thing. But making an application as clear and as concise as possible for both you to understand, the officer to understand, but also the residents. Residents will generally object more to applications that aren't clear because they don't understand it fully. So what they don't understand, they generally object to say you can't approve this because we don't know what the impact's going to be, all that kind of thing. And to be honest, you're lucky if you get to that stage, because if you submit information that's not correct or information that's incomplete, you could get your application could be made invalid. And I've done a video on this before, but making an invalid application adds so much time to your application, a stupid amount of time, because quite often councils have two teams. They'll have a team for validation and they'll have a team that is the planning officers. Sometimes they're mixed between the two, but that because the teams are separated, that adds a huge amount of time if your application is getting validated. So making your application as clear as possible is a really, really good tactic. And again, don't forget how busy officers are. If officers have got huge amounts of work going on, 100 plus, and they go through an application that's invalid, they're not going to go the extra mile to get back to you to kind of validate it. It will just be invalidated, and you're going to be waiting a long time to get the planning process even started. So submitting a very clear, concise application with all the information that's needed is important. Again, as I said in another video, every council has lists. They're called validation lists. Have a look at what your development is, whether it's like a household extension or a new building or a change of use, commercial property, whatever. They'll have validation requirements dependent on the scale of your application. So have a look at that and just make sure you submit every report, because otherwise it will just get thrown back to you and you'll spend ages toing and froing with the department, and you'll get off on the wrong foot from the outset. And the last kind of, bonus strategy, I guess, is to use permitted development wherever possible. I know this video is about how to get planning permission, but if you can avoid the whole planning process, the whole submitting an application waiting for consultation, getting through the validation process, negotiating with an officer, getting angry with an officer because they're making decisions that you don't agree with, and then going to appeal, and then taking the time to go to appeal. If you can just use permitted development, which is black and white, and just, is the development you're doing acceptable or not, then the determination period is quicker. There's in certain instances there is, but most of the time there's no consultation period, and the issues that can be considered under permitted development are a lot lower than a planning permission. And also, permitted development means that you don't have to provide any financial contributions to to your development, because once you submit a planning application, you have to comply with policies, and quite often those policies include contributions and support for other things going on within the council. Sometimes that's affordable housing, or sometimes that's affordable workspace, or just contributions towards public realm improvements, or contributions towards cycling and pedestrian improvements, that kind of thing. So using permitted development is not only quicker, it's cheaper, and it's more certain than going anywhere near the planning process. And also, like I said, I've already said it, but you avoid appeals, and avoiding appeals is massive. If you get refused, there's no point in appealing, it's just wrong, and then you can just go back, resubmit an application refined to what is permitted, and then you'll have the development that you're looking for. So if you can use permitted development, I would always advise to use it.